of God's good creation, of man's fall and rebellion, and of God's gracious work of redemption and restoration through Christ. From Genesis to Revelation, that is the story. We're walking through the book of Genesis right now. We're talking about things in the beginning. And today, a taste of things to come. I invite you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapters 13 and 14, where we'll be walking today through stories that involve Abram, or Abraham later, Lot, and a mysterious character by the name of Melchizedek. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, we concluded Genesis chapter 12, seeing Abram and Sarai, later to be called Abraham and Sarah, actually being deported from Egypt, escorted out. They are quite wealthy by this time. Livestock, silver, gold, servants. But as they're removed from Egypt, where will they go? How about home? How about home? Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 4 begins with these words. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. If you remember the story of Abraham, God had told him to leave his father's house, to leave all that he knew and go to a land that God would show him. And he packed up and he took his family and he went westward, finally coming to what we call the land of Canaan, later to be Israel, the promised land. And this is where Abram wanders. But when he reached that place and God said, this is it, he was at the place later to be named Bethel. Does anyone here know what Bethel means? Names in the Bible are actually very important. Beth-el. Beth is house. El is a shortening of El Elyon, one of the names for God. It means God Most High. Bethel means the house of the Most High God. We're better to dwell than in the presence of God. And there Abram pitched his tent. He was a Bedouin. He was a wanderer. He didn't lay a concrete foundation and build a house in which to dwell. But he went home where his tent had been at the beginning. I find it interesting that Moses uses the word beginning when he records this story, because the beginning had actually been much farther east in what we today would call Iraq or Iran. But Abram's story, it seems, begins in the promised land, at Bethel. He had built an altar there. He had made a place of worship. And when he had been there, and now when he returns there, we're told that he called on the name of the Lord. He looked to God for wisdom and guidance. He prayed, he worshiped, he surrendered, he submitted. Where was your beginning? Your spiritual beginning, your walk with God beginning? Oh, it might have been in a vacation Bible school years ago, such as some of our children here that have now gone back to Kid City. It might have been growing up in a preacher's house and you didn't have a choice. It might have been in college when you encountered a campus ministry like Ivy InterVarsity or others. It might have been on your mama's knee. Where was your spiritual beginning? Sometimes we need to return to our roots. Sometimes we need to pause and remember. Sometimes as we walk through life, sometimes we lose some of the zeal and some of the excitement. Some of the times we just begin to take for granted the goodness and mercies of God. Sometimes we forget what it was like in that moment of surrender. Sometimes we forget. Walter Brueggemann, a Methodist pastor, a prolific author, he said, "Remember your baptism and rejoice." Sometimes we need to remember. Abram went back to Bethel, where he had built an altar, and he called on the name of the Lord. Sometimes we need to renew. We need to re-energize. Sitting next to my bed on my nightstand, I have a lamp, I have a book, and I have the charger for my phone. And when I go down to bed at night, my phone goes on the charger. Because the batteries run down. I need to charge that puppy. Otherwise, I can't use it the next day. Maybe that's a good idea. If you try to get a hold of me, it goes straight to voicemail. I just didn't charge my phone, okay? But we need to renew. We need to recharge, if you will. In some ways, that's what we do this morning. But not just Sunday mornings, please. You see, we need to constantly reconnect with God. We need to constantly reconnect. We need to be like Abram and return. But as we go on in the story, we begin to read about some tensions. We begin to read about some strife. Abraham and his nephew Lot owned much. And they had herdsmen who were caring for their flocks and their herds. And they were having rising tensions because the land could not sustain all the livestock. And Abram, ever the peacemaker it seems, in verse 8 of chapter 13 says, "Please," he's speaking to Lot, "please let there be no strife between you and me, or between our herdsmen, for we are brothers." Now, in family standing, it was uncle and nephew. But notice what Abram does. He says, we're brothers. We're in this together. We have both left our home back in the east and have come to this land that God has shown us. Is there any strife in your life? You ever have conflict with people? Well, if you don't, please catch me afterwards and tell me how you do that. Man, I'm always seems to be at odds with somebody. I want to be more like Abram. And it's interesting. Let me read for you chapter 13, verses 9 through 12. I think this is really interesting. Abram is still speaking to Lot, what we just began with, and he says, "Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, I'll go to the right. Or if to the right, I'll go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. You ever feel like someone that you cared about took advantage of you? Do you catch what happens in this paragraph? Abram says, Lot, you pick. Where do you want to live? Where do you want your flocks and herds to graze? Where do you want to call home? And Lot surveys the land. There's the rugged, dry, arid, hope we get rain parts of what is Israel today. And then there's the Jordan Valley. And it's green and lush and fertile. And Lot goes, I want the good land. Do you catch that? I want the good land. Uncle Abe, you can have the rest. And Abraham doesn't balk. He doesn't debate. He doesn't question. He had opened it up. He said, Lot, choose what you will. Abram gives Lot first choice, and Lot chooses the best. I probably would have too, just to be honest. And Abram settles in the land of Canaan, which interestingly enough is the land that God had intended for him from the beginning. Sometimes we just need to be generous and give because that's what God would have us do. But if I'm generous, I'll get taken advantage of. Okay. But if I'm generous, I won't have enough for myself. Maybe. But sometimes we just need to say, for the sake of relieving tension, for the sake of eliminating strife, in the pursuit of peace between you and me, I give, regardless of what you take. Isn't that interesting? You see it there in the life of Abram and his nephew Lot. But there's a warning here as well. Not everything was good. Not everything was going the way it should. One more verse, verse 13, where I just left off, simply interjects this thought. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Lot chose the good ground, but he chose bad company. Just wait till we get to chapter 19. I think you know probably much of that story already. You see, if we pursue the ways of Lot, if we pursue the way that sometimes says, this looks good because of the benefit that I'll receive from it, we might find that it wasn't the best decision in the first place. It wasn't the wisest thing to do. Maybe we should pray more, like Abram at the altar. Maybe we should seek wise counsel from men and women who know God and love God and trust God so we can trust them. Maybe sometimes we, need to do our research on the internet before we move into a neighborhood. Would have saved Lot a lot of pain. Exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord. Hard to avoid in our world, isn't it? And let's be honest, it's hard to avoid in the church. But at verse 14, the story returns to Abram and the promises of God. Genesis 13, verses 14 through 18, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. And Abram moved his tent, and he came and he dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Lot had taken the best land. I wonder if Abram sat there for a moment, scratched his head, and thought, well, what now? And as he was sitting there, in my imagination, we read that God spoke to him and said, lift up your eyes. You ever notice that sometimes when we're discouraged, when we're depressed, when we're frustrated, when things aren't going well, we become what? Downcast. Our head's trying to drop. Our eyes don't see the horizon anymore. And God says to Abram, lift up your eyes. Can you hear God tell you right now, this moment, lift up your eyes? What does God lay out before you so that you might grow in the grace and knowledge of His Son, so that you might walk with Him as His disciple, so that your life will impact the lives of countless others, just as Abram's will? Lift up your eyes. There's so much discouragement in our world. I struggle with it. I didn't know what Gretchen was going to read this morning, and this isn't in my notes because I didn't know. My favorite hymn is "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us. Sometimes you ever feel that way. But God says, lift up your eyes. See what I have in store for you. And He tells Abram, He says, lift up your eyes. He says, now look around. Do a full 360, Abram. Look northward, southward, eastward, westward. As far as your eye can see, this is my gift to you and to your descendants forever. No wonder it is called the promised land. For it is the gift of God's promise to Abram and to all his descendants. But think about that for a minute. You're Abram. You're old. And He says, to your descendants, and you think, Sarai and I don't have any children. Matter of fact, she's barren. She's incapable of having children. This promise just took on a whole different dimension, didn't it? It wasn't just look at this land, but it's something is going to have to happen. Some intervention by God is going to have to take place for this to ever find fulfillment. Descendants? Me? And God says, count the dust. Can you imagine that? Now, some of you will find this gross, but I don't dust. You can come in my office and run your finger on my bookshelf, and there's dust. I don't dust. I figure someday I'm going to be dust, so hey, that might be one of my friends sitting there on my bookshelf. I don't want to disturb their rest. Count the dust. Think about that. Count the dust. Such will your descendants be if anyone could number the dust on the planet. Oh God, don't you exaggerate a little bit. Well, it's interesting because the fulfillment is actually twofold. The first fulfillment is simply found in the Hebrew people, in the Jewish race. Those who would physically be born from Abraham through Isaac, the child of promise, whose story we'll get to, and Jacob, who fathers the 12 tribes. But even more so, the children of faith, those who believe God and have it credited to them as righteousness. You see, the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 29, says this, "And if you belong to Christ..." Now, show of hands. If you belong to Christ, raise your hand. If you're a Christian, raise your hand. All right, those of you without hands up, I hope soon you will have your hand up with me. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. So how many of you are Abraham's descendants? All the hands that were up the first time should have been up the second time. Okay? If you follow what Paul's writing there, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? Words that God spoke to Abram so very, very long ago. And so Abraham rolls up his tent, gets his wife and all that they own, which is considerable, and he moves again near the oaks of Mamre, which is near Hebron. And what does he do? He builds an altar. Abram is a man of worship. At Bethel, at Mamre, wherever we find Abram, we find him worshiping. Do we worship? And not just on Sunday morning, but are our lives a constant gift of praise, a sacrifice of praise unto him? Ah, man, when it's Monday and you're at work and everything's going wrong, and you want to say those words that you know your mom would wash her mouth out with if she heard you, how about praising God? You're driving and the traffic's backed up and someone cuts you off. How about praising God? You're shopping and this line has one person and this one has four, so you get in this one and then the little light goes on that is called the manager. How about praising God? We're so quick to rush to the negative. We're so easily distracted from the things that matter. How about we be like Abram and figuratively build an altar in your car, at your workplace desk, in your home, wherever you might be, because you're one of his descendants. You're an heir according to promise. But even with that, in this world, there's hardship. As we roll into chapter 14, we find not tensions, not strife between brothers, but we find war between nations. It was not uncommon in days of old, and it is not uncommon in our day, is it? There's war in the Ukraine, and it wasn't too long ago that we were in Afghanistan, and it wasn't long before that when we were in Iran. And it wasn't long before that when we were in Somalia. And it wasn't long before that and we were in Vietnam. And it wasn't long before that and we were in Korea. And it wasn't long before... Do I need to go on? What is it about us? Man's inhumanity to man. To stab, to shoot, to bomb, to eliminate. Chapter 14, and I'm not going to read this section. It's long. You can read it later if you will. In chapter 14, verses 1 through 16, a number of kingdoms, a number of kings unite, and they're going to come down south toward Sodom. Who lives in Sodom? Lot. Who's Lot? Abram's nephew. Why is he in Sodom? He took the best land. And these armies from the north advance to the south. Sodom is conquered. Lot and his family are captured. And Abram is informed. News reaches his ear. Now, I might have sat back and said, serves him right. But that's because I'm kind of petty. Abram's not that way. Abram musters his men, several hundred. And he pursues the enemy beyond Damascus. Now, I don't know if you know your Middle Eastern geography very well, but Sodom sits down near the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, and Damascus is clear up in Syria. Abram pursues this army for many, many, many miles. And he overtakes them. He defeats them. He rescues Lot and all the others who had been taken captive along with him. Chapter 14, verse 16 says, he brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and all the women and all the people. Abram was victorious. And then we come, here you go. That's my introduction. Okay? Are you ready for the sermon now? Yeah, some of you just got real nervous. As Abram returns, he is met on the way by a person by the name of Melchizedek. I went to high school with the Nichols boys. Dave married a good friend of ours by the name of Dina, and Dave always said that he was going to name his firstborn son Melchizedek. Dina vetoed that. They named him Chad. Melchizedek. I wish I could tell you more about him than we know. He is a mystery in the pages of Scripture. We find him here in Genesis 14. We find him in Psalms. And we find him in Hebrews. And we know very little about him. Some very mysterious character that God works through. But I titled my sermon, A Taste of Things to Come, because of Melchizedek. We're told first that he was king of Salem. Now, later, Salem will be renamed. Anyone want to guess? You got it. Who said that? Very good. You get a sticker. Jerusalem. Melchizedek is king of Salem. Salem is shalom, peace. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He is the king of Jerusalem. He is the king of peace. Keep that in mind. He is the priest of, and interestingly enough, the word that is used here in the ancient is El Elyon. El, Beth El, house of God Most High, El Elyon. He is the priest of God Most High. Interesting. He predates Moses. We're not even close to Moses yet. We're not even close to the writing of the law and the practices of Jewish faith. We don't have Moses' brother Aaron being installed as the high priest. But here is Melchizedek, who is a foreshadowing not of the Old Testament priesthood, but of the New Testament priesthood of Jesus. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, we read these words. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil. That veil being the curtain in the temple, behind which was the Ark of the Covenant and the anticipated or perspective of the presence of God, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us. Jesus opened that. Remember, the veil is torn, and we now have access to God through Jesus. Where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. In theology, we sometimes talk type and antitype. And the Old Testament is the type, and the New Testament is the antitype or the fulfillment. The Passover lamb of the Exodus with Moses. The Passover lamb, which is Jesus. Okay? Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God. Jesus, a high priest forever. This mysterious individual simply gives us a taste of things to come. While we might wish to know more about him, here's my warning to you. I know too many people who go, "Oh, I want to know more about Melchizedek. I wish we knew more about this fellow who we're told has no father, has no mother, who was like the Son of God." Read that in Hebrews chapter 7 and let your mind spin for a while. But the passage isn't about Melchizedek. The passage is about Jesus. And when we get sidetracked on Melchizedek and we miss Jesus, we make a grave error. He's simply a foreshadowing. He is a picture of what is to come in Jesus. You see, it's one story from Genesis to Revelation, not a bunch of little disjointed stories, each with a moral application. One story. And all the way back in the day of Abram, there is this glimpse of what God will do when He sends His Son, Jesus, to redeem us. Suffice it to say that the Old Testament law and sacrifices presented by the descendants of Aaron could not, were not even meant to, bring salvation. A different priest, an eternal high priest, not in the line of Aaron, but in the line of Melchizedek, if you will, who offers a sacrifice and is himself the sacrifice, was needed. A high priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is Jesus. Now back to Genesis 14. What does Melchizedek do in relationship with Abram? 3 things. 3 things that we do. He brought out bread and wine. Now, I know I put the picture up here, but does that make you think of anything that Jesus does? Does Jesus bring out bread and wine? And He blesses it, and He breaks it, and He gives it, and He says, "Take and eat, take and drink. This is my body. This is my blood." Melchizedek brought out bread and wine for Abram. And then secondly, he blessed him. And he blessed God. Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor, or maybe the better word there is creator of heaven and earth. And Jesus blesses us. Ever read the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are you when you are persecuted. Jesus blesses us in so many ways. And He blessed God. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Jesus leads us in worship. And Jesus Himself receives our worship. And then the third thing, interestingly enough, he receives from Abraham a gift. Abraham gives him a tenth of all the bounty, all the booty that he had taken in battle. There was no tithe yet, but Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe, if you will. Which is interesting because when he finally gets to Sodom, the king of Sodom, out of appreciation, says, Abram, take anything and everything you want. And Abram says, no, I don't want anything from you because I don't want you to say, I made Abram wealthy. I want people to be able to say, God blessed Abram, not the king of Sodom. But when Abram is with Melchizedek, he gives, and Melchizedek receives. Isn't that interesting? Melchizedek is a taste of things to come. We don't remain there in Genesis 13 and 14. Genesis 13 and 14 is filled with the struggles of humanity. Strife within a family, Abram and Lot. War between nations, the north and the south in that story. Our days are sometimes hard. But maybe if we went back to the first thing in the story, if we returned, if we took time to remember, if we would renew and reconnect with Christ our Lord, we might find ourselves living like our ancestor of faith, Abram. For if you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's descendants, heirs of the promise. How'd you like to be a part of that family? Jesus extends his call and says, come unto me, anyone who's weary and tired, heavy laden. Come to me, and I'll give you rest. And as we sing this song, I want you to hear Jesus saying, come to me. And if you will, do just that.